Students. Here we are with part 4 of our look at American culture and the other. And we're going to zoom in today on African Americans from the period 1920 to 1945. Hopefully you watched the previous video because that covered African Americans in the earlier period of 1880 through 1920. And so I'm going to skip all of the context that I normally do. I will jump back and just remind us that this is the period of what's called the Great Migration. The Great Migration is represented here as we see the drop in African Americans living in the South. The percentage goes down significantly from 90 in 1900 down to 79%. So down 10%, which doesn't sound like a whole lot, but it was the first movement down. You'll see it's pretty much flat before that. African Americans stayed in the South. You'll notice even as the Civil War ended, you only lost 1% at the end of the Civil War. So when slavery ended, most African Americans stayed in the South for a variety of reasons. Usually it was to try to reunite with their families, but a lot of times it was just a lack of resources for that move. When we looked at immigrants, if I didn't accentuate this, I should have, that immigrants are rarely ever the poorest people that are moving out of their area, migrants in general, unless they are completely desperate refugee type situation. That is a very small minority of all the people who move. Usually people who move are people who can move. And so you see over here, we're going to have the people that have moved into maybe even what we call the black middle class, which I did talk about in the last video, or at least the upper levels of the lower classes. In the 1910s, 1920s, they have the ability to move. There's a lot of what we call intervening opportunities, the most significant being open jobs in the North due to the need for the war. But also they got to get there. And so you see like cheaper automobiles allow poorer people to have access to them. And that's going to assist people in moving. So with that context, let's jump into what we're talking about here, which is the effect of that movement. What happens when a large number of people all of a sudden move into a new area? Well, as you can probably guess, just like what happened to Italian immigrants and Russian immigrants, they were pushed into what we call ethnic enclaves, ethnic neighborhoods, where they were generally with people of their same social classes, the lower classes, but also within their same ethnic groups. A lot of times these ethnic groups had conflicts with each other, and the most glaring difference, of course, is going to be race. And so African Americans are pushed into their own neighborhoods in all of these major cities that they're going to move into. And this is going to include places like Chicago and New York and Detroit, things like that. But it does also include border cities like Louisville, Cincinnati, St. Louis, places like that. Whereas African Americans move up from the South, they're going to be, maybe their final destination was going to be Chicago, but they find a job in Louisville and they stay there and set up roots, at least temporarily. So when African Americans settled, this gave them the chance to actually give birth to what we call the modern African American culture. And this modern culture, this rebirth, as we know from world history, a rebirth is called the Renaissance. And so this is going to be called the Harlem Renaissance, named after the largest black neighborhood. It's going to be in New York City, which was formerly a Dutch suburb, white people suburb. African Americans are pushed into this area of New York, and it becomes the center of this new cultural rebirth. It's going to include art. It's going to include literature. It's going to include politics. There's going to be a lot of new ideas that come out of here, and it's all focused on the black community. And the most important feature of it, as opposed to earlier African American culture, is that it's completely independent of agriculture. African American culture was agriculture. Prior to this, that was the centerpiece. Now it's going to be different. African Americans are moving into an industrial city, and they're moving into it at a later period when we've already seen some victories by workers in terms of hours and pay. So even though African Americans are going to be discriminated against, they still have leisure time. And when a culture has leisure time, they have the time to produce art and literature. So here are some examples of art from the Harlem Renaissance. What I want you to notice in here is that it is very eclectic. Eclectic means that it brings together a lot of different elements from a lot of different places. So it is African in the sense that it draws from African heritage. Here in this piece, you have an African mask. Here, of course, the Egyptian headdress on an African American woman, and these are meant to draw the roots back to Africa. This sculpture in particular, I believe it's entitled "The Ethiopian Woman," and it is a reference to, at the time, Ethiopia was the only African country that resisted colonization by Europeans. The Italians had tried to invade it, and they resisted. And so it was a source of strength for African American culture to have this one area, this one country that had defied European colonization. And of course, the big thing to note down here is that the figures in African American art are African American. They're of African descent. They're Black people, and that was essential to developing this culture, because prior to this, if you'll remember, even in art, even in movies and things like that, and plays, African Americans were portrayed by white people. And so for African Americans to make African American art with African American subjects or African subjects, that was a big step. And it was a big empowering part of the Harlem Renaissance. Likewise, the poetry and the literature that's going to come out of this is going to focus on subjects that and feelings that ethnic group feels. And so some of you guys read "Their Eyes Were Watching God" by Hurston. So that's the perspective of not just an African American, but African American woman, and so you have multiple perspectives there. The poems that I have here are some of the more popular, the defining poems of the era. There are hundreds of other poems. I couldn't put them all on here, so I selected 3 sections here. So Harlem by Langston Hughes, probably the most popular, most well-known. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? Some of you guys might have seen that play or read that play. It's set in a later period, but it's a very good play. Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? There's a lot in that very short poem. The fact that African Americans had been pushing that dream of freedom, true freedom, for so long that for some it went away, but for others it's going to explode into anger, and we're going to see that in a little bit. Claude McKay above my picture right here. He's talking about how much he loves America, despite the fact that he calls it a cultured hell, because it's going to give. They're African Americans are taking that chance, and how are they getting there? Well, they got a one-way ticket up north. That's the poem over here. That's awesome, by Langston Hughes. Another key element of the Harlem Renaissance is jazz music. Jazz music is a fusion. It had been around for a while. It really started in New Orleans, where you had a lot of multiple cultural influences. So African American jazz is going to be a mixture of African and Caribbean music with some of the classical European music, but it's really America's first cultural movement created completely by African Americans. And as you can see from the picture up here, it begins with the African American crowd, but as most of you guys know, it's eventually going to spread to a white crowd, where we're actually going to have race mixing, in the sense that African Americans are going to be on stage, white people are going to be in the audience, and even at some clubs, especially when prohibition sets in and you're doing illegal things anyway, you might actually have integrated speakeasies. Speakeasies are like secret nightclubs and bars during the Prohibition era, and so there's a lot to study in jazz. You take a whole college class on it. I'm going to spend a minute here, and it doesn't do it justice at all. But there's a lot of experimentation. It's a lot of breaking the molds. If you're breaking molds with who's playing the music anyway, you might as well break some of the other conventions. And so jazz ranges from very structured swing music that's very dancey to very experimental, very complex music. The Cotton Club over to the left is the biggest club in Harlem. Of course, the name is intentional, right? But you have this was So you're going to have white people going into black neighborhoods to even wealthy people to view some of these huge musicians. Below me here, we have Louis Armstrong with the trumpet right here, Duke Ellington. These are two of the primary musicians during the time. And you have females as well. So this is going to be a culture movement. Of course, white people are going to start, especially white young people, and this is going to cause some racial tension as well. The older generation is not going to like their children consuming black music, black culture, and it's going to lead to what's going to start in the 20s of this cultural war. There's a lot of things that happen in the 20s, and it's a lot of conservative America versus these new values. We know that politically the Republicans are in charge, and so conservative America is still the mainstream. But all of these things are going to challenge those, and sometimes they're going to erupt into violence. But before we get there, we got to talk about the political movements. Black nationalism and Pan-Africanism. These are some isms that you should know, some point of views might show up on the test. Black nationalism is exactly what it sounds like. We remember that the definition of nationalism is looking out for your people, the interests of your people before all others. Well, for an African American, who is your people? It's not white America, it's Black America. And so Black nationalism is going to say that that African Americans should take care of themselves. African American neighborhoods should be governed, and the economic system should be developed by fellow African Americans, because what you have in all of these neighborhoods, even up until the present, is the people that live in the African American neighborhoods do not own the businesses in the African American neighborhoods. Oftentimes, up until the very present day, you had police and representative government that was not representative of the neighborhoods themselves. And so Black nationalism is going to push for that independence, not in a sense of like a freedom movement, although some people did, but in a sense of taking care of themselves. This is going to be the foundation for what we're going to see later on in American history, or you would if we continued teaching it, but we can't because of coronavirus. That's going to lead to people like Malcolm X, Muhammad Ali, the Black Panthers. They're going to find the foundation here with Black nationalism. And so two of the main figures in the African American political movement during this time are Marcus Garvey. He's seen above my image here in his Napoleon hat. Marcus Garvey was a real interesting character. He was Jamaican originally, but he migrated to New York. And he had this vision. It was called the Back to Africa movement. He did start what's called the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which was in its original days kind of along the same lines of W.E.B. Du Bois, who, pushing for developing African American intelligence beyond trade schools. But Garvey turned much, much more political, and he started, especially after the Spanish American War, you had a lot of African American soldiers fighting in that. He got this vision of freeing Africa from European colonialism, and he envisioned Africa as this like giant one state government that was going to be ruled by African Americans because they were the most culturally and militarily developed. And so he had this vision that he was going to form this army of African Americans. They're going to go take back Africa from the Europeans, and presumably all the indigenous African people would rise up to join them, and then they would rule over them as kind of the superior culture. This actually caused the division between him and Du Bois. They were together at the beginning, and then Du Bois said, that not only is that stupid, but it is it's wrong to think that just because we have been living under Western culture that then we are somehow culturally superior to indigenous African people. Du Bois was pushing more of something called Pan-Africanism, which is basically working together with people of African descent from all over the globe. So the word is diaspora. It means that where people have been spread from their homeland. We oftentimes refer to it with Jews, but there's an African diaspora that includes Africa, but it also includes the Caribbean and all of the Americas, as well as Africans that were moved throughout the Middle East and Asia during the slave trade as well. And so he was trying to promote kind of a Congress of Pan-Africanism to raise up people of African descent where they are, not move back to Africa necessarily, although Du Bois does eventually go to Africa. But it's more of this uniting thing. It's not a let's take it over thing. Garvey ends up in jail. I can't remember what for, but he was kind of on the watch list because he was so militant. Du Bois, if you remember, he started the Niagara movement, which pushed for civil rights. That kind of morphs into the organization that still exists today called the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, focuses on lawsuits against discrimination and scholarships for, remember, Du Bois believed that they should send a talented tenth of African Americans, top 10% of African Americans, to college to form the leaders of the future. Du Bois was oftentimes associated with socialism, the socialist movement, and for a time he was actually part of the Communist Party as well, because the Communist Party in America saw a way to expand their numbers. Of course, communism is a radical philosophy that's going to only attract people that really see no other option. And African Americans, of course, having been held down for so long, it was kind of a fertile ground for the Communist Party. And so for quite a while, Du Bois, like many other intellectual African Americans, were into radical socialism as a way to kind of force equality. After a while, Du Bois split with the communists because he believed that they were just kind of exploiting the African American community just for their numbers, basically. But it's going to come to a head in a real famous case in the 1930s called the Scottsboro case, and we'll talk about that in just a second. Really quick, Du Bois in the 1930s, he writes his biggest work, his most famous work, Black Reconstruction in America, which looks like I misspelled over there. I'm sorry. And that is covering the Black history from Reconstruction on. But what he did was he was specifically addressing the narrative that had developed called the Lost Cause, that said that Southern culture was ultimately good and that white people cared for their slaves, and they were fighting for their way of life against the inevitable force of industrial movement, and that was what people believed. The South was able to push that as part of the deal, the unspoken deal that was made by whites in the North and the South, that we want to get past the pain of the Civil War by just basically letting the South tell the story. Now, Du Bois is going to be the first African American that's going to tell his side of the story, which of course is going to be very different. And most of what we know about Reconstruction now is based on Du Bois's work rather than what the South has said, which, most of what we know, what I mean is historians. Culturally, the lost cause of the white South still has a real big influence, which is why a few years ago we had all the conflict about removing Confederate statues. Du Bois, just to go on, I'm going to wrap it up here. Actually, I'm going to stop. There's going to be two parts to this video, but Du Bois lived until the into the 1950s, maybe even the 60s, and so he was able to see the beginnings of the later civil rights movement. But he was actually shamed in the 1950s after World War II. There's going to be a second Red Scare. We covered Red Scare a few videos ago, targeting communists. And because of his past with the Communist Party, he was basically run out of the country by the FBI and the CIA. And that's when he ended up in Africa working for African rights during the period of decolonization when the Europeans were leaving. And he actually died over in Africa. But his influence, as I said, is profound, especially in kind of modern civil rights movements that include elements of Black nationalism. The most
What button should I press? Join.